Hello, this is Professor James Strickler, and this is a course in American government. This lesson is from Unit 1 about theories of government. It's Lesson 6 about the rule of one. In this lesson, you'll learn about Aristotle's forms of government. You'll learn about the positives and negatives of rule of one. You'll learn what a monarchy is, and you'll learn about tyranny and despotism. Now, in the previous lessons, we've decided that we need government. Now, the next step is to decide what form that government should take. To analyze this question, we'll refer back to the teachings of the ancient Greek Aristotle, who lived over 2,000 years ago. Aristotle was a brilliant man that wrote on many subjects, from science to politics. And one of the things that he examined was the potential forms that government can take. And his way of categorizing different forms of government has been passed down through the ages and is still used today. So let's build a chart to look at the different forms of government as Aristotle understood them. Let's first divide the potential forms of government into three categories. Aristotle said that we could have a government that is ruled by a single person, rule of one. Or we could have government ruled by a few people. Or we could have government ruled by the many. In other words, by the masses, the people. Aristotle further divided up his different forms of government by the purpose that they were attempting to serve. One potential purpose of government, whether it be rule of one, a few, or the many, is to benefit the entire community. A different purpose would be to benefit the ruler or the rulers, whoever they may be. In this lesson, we're going to focus on the idea of rule of one. In the next lesson, Lesson 7, we'll talk about the rule of the few. And in the following lesson, Lesson 8, we will talk about the rule of the many. When we're talking about the rule of one, what we're referring to is a single person being in charge, such as a king or a dictator. Well, don't dismiss that idea out of hand. Perhaps you've grown up in the United States of America, where we've always had a government that was not a king, not a dictator during your lifetime. And so you kind of assume that those sorts of governments are not the way to do things. But instead of assuming that, let's take a few moments and actually consider whether or not having a single person in charge is a good idea. There are actually some positive features of having rule of just one person. When you only have one person in charge, the government can be very simple. Decisions can be centralized. There's one person deciding what to do, rather than it having to go through endless votes and committees and hearings and things like that. That can make the government very efficient. When there's a problem, it can be taken care of immediately. But there are also some negative features of rule of one. When you have just one person in charge, that person can act impulsively. Perhaps they get angry about something and they throw out a decision which may not be well thought out and could have bad consequences for the country. They can also be arbitrary in their rule. They don't have to follow any sort of set procedures or standards or laws or rules. Because they're in charge, if they simply don't like how someone behaved one day, They can have that person perhaps executed. And then the next day, if a similar thing happens, they can decide to reward that person. There doesn't have to be any consistency. It's whatever their mood happens to be. Now, whether the rule of one ends up being positive or negative may simply depend on the attitude and talent of the one person fulfilling that position. Maybe with the right person, it would be a good, efficient government. But with the wrong person, it would be an evil, arbitrary government. Something that will make a big difference in this, of whether or not the government under a single person ends up being a positive or negative experience for the people, is whether or not that single ruler is selfish or selfless. Now, let's go back to the chart we were creating. Notice that in the row where we have rule of one, we have two empty boxes. One in the column for a ruler who wants to benefit the whole community, and one in the column for a ruler who just wants to benefit himself. Aristotle described the rule of one for the benefit of the whole community as a monarchy. A monarch is a selfless king who serves the people. If you could always be sure that when you have the rule of one, you're going to have a monarch, then it isn't necessarily a bad form of government. Aristotle labeled the rule of one that is for the benefit of only the ruler as tyranny. A tyrant, for Aristotle, who he sometimes also described as a despot, is a selfish king that only serves himself. And this is the real danger of the rule of one. As I said a moment ago, if you could be sure that you would always have what Aristotle called a monarch, a selfless king, perhaps even a wise selfless king, then this wouldn't be a bad way to run a country. But there's always the severe danger that either that selfless king will end up becoming a tyrant, or when that selfless king dies and the next monarch takes over, that person will be a tyrant. And as a consequence, the entire country will suffer. That completes this lesson. Now let's review what we learned. Which of the following are examples of Aristotle's structures of government? Did Aristotle talk about things that we could call parliaments and congresses? Or did he talk about prime ministers and presidents? Or did he talk about kings, councils, and public meetings? Or did he talk about assemblies and divisions? Now, the answer to this question may not have been as obvious as some other questions that we've done in reviews for previous lessons. But think about it. You were told that Aristotle divided government up into three categories: rule of one, rule of a few, and rule of the many. Well, a king is one, a council is a few, and a public meeting is rule of the many. Those are the kind of structures that symbolize the different categories of Aristotle's division of government. What are Aristotle's purposes of government? These are the two columns that we had in the chart that we made. Were the purposes freedom and control? Were they peace and war? Were they self-interest and public interest? Or were they compromise, consent, and conflict? Remember, the two categories were about a ruler acting for the benefit of the community or acting for the benefit of himself. This is the public interest or self-interest. What is a positive of having the rule of a single person? Is it that the government then is very efficient? Or is it that there's lots of ideas being discussed? Or is it that there is open debate in government? Or is it that the opinion of the public is respected? The positive of having a single person in charge is that the government can be very efficient. What is a negative of having the rule of one? Is it public ignorance? Is it competing interests? Is it arbitrary laws? Or is it difficult decision making? A negative of having a single person in charge is that they can enforce arbitrary rules. What kind of a ruler was Aristotle's monarch? Is that how Aristotle referred to any king? Or is that how he referred to a self-serving king? Or is it a public-serving king? Or is it an elected king? Monarch is the label that Aristotle gave to a public-serving king. What kind of ruler was Aristotle's tyrant? Was Aristotle's tyrant any king, or a self-serving king, or a public-serving king, or an elected king? Aristotle's tyrant was a self-serving king. Now, keep in mind that no king is going to want to be labeled a tyrant and admit that he or she is self-serving. So any single ruler that is in a position like this is a lot more likely to call themselves a monarch, even if they aren't really. That's why in our modern world, we generally refer to kings as monarchs, even though Aristotle reserved that term for good kings. That completes this lesson. The next lesson will also be from Unit 1. It'll be Lesson 7 about the rule of the few.